Have you ever heard a voice assistant mispronounce a place name? Or read an automated transcript packed with nonsense words that don't match what was actually said? You're not alone. It's a common problem affecting speech technologies. A lot of speech technology has been trained on a pretty narrow slice of how people around the world actually speak. For example, Google leans on YouTube videos to train its Gemini AI models and audio generation tools. So, don't be surprised when your voice assistant starts sounding a little too much like your favourite YouTuber. In other words, AI voice technologies have a representation problem. I'm Stiris Alpanis, Innovation Lead at State Library Victoria, and you're listening to an SLV LAB podcast, part of its Conversation series, where we discuss emerging technology, digital experimentation, and library futures with artists, technologists, and workers in the cultural sector.
There are 8 billion people in the world, and there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world by 8 billion people. If I go back 2 or 3 years, there were 7,200 languages spoken. There's a huge piece here about language loss and about cultural loss and identity loss. And I think a lot of the work that is done in Common Voice is driven by the desire to ensure that cultures survive, because culture is grounded in language.
In this episode, we spoke to technologist and researcher Kathy Reid. Kathy's the head of AI and machine learning at Mozilla Data Collective, which aims to develop a fairer model for data stewardship, including how organisations like galleries, libraries, archives and museums can protect digital collections from indiscriminate scraping while still enabling responsible reuse, and possibly generating some revenue. Kathy introduced the work of Mozilla Common Voice, a community-led project that collects speech data across languages and dialects and makes it available for building more representative voice technologies. We spoke about the gaps, variations and biases in language, and we learned about Kathy's own pathway into voice tech and research. The following conversation was recorded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems, and would also like to acknowledge and pay our respects to any First Nation listeners joining us for this conversation. So, to begin with, could you tell us a bit about Mozilla Common Voice and what it aims to do?
So Common Voice started around 2017. And if we cast back to 2017, which I can't believe is 9 years ago now, there are a lot of things happening in artificial intelligence and machine learning around 2017. It's where we really saw this step change in how machine learning and artificial intelligence operated. And some of the things that we take for granted now, or words that are very familiar to us now, like transformers or ChatGPT, so the T in ChatGPT is transformers, those things were actually just being built in 2017, so that's how far the field has moved in under a decade. And so in 2017, when we went to build speech technologies like speech recognition, which transcribes spoken audio into text, the tools that we had at that stage were very, very much built around needing a lot of speech data that was very well transcribed in order to build machine learning models. And one of the big issues that we had around 2017 was a data scarcity issue. So in 2017, it took around 10,000 hours of recorded speech to build a speech recognition model that had any sort of level of accuracy. And so Common Voice is really a response to a data scarcity problem. So the first release of Common Voice was at the end of 2017. And at the end of 2017, there was about 500 hours of English speech, which by today's standards isn't very much at all if we consider that speech recognition programs like Whisper are trained on, Whisper was originally trained on about 680,000 hours of speech data. So 500 hours now doesn't seem like a lot, but it was a lot then. And that enabled a speech recognition program called Deep Speech to be created. At the time it was written in or worked for both English and Mandarin. And then Common Voice grew from there. So it expanded from the original 2 languages. And as of, I'm not sure if I'm officially allowed to say this, but we're releasing Common Voice 25 this week. And we'll have 350 languages supported from, the two that we started with in 2017. So yeah, Common Voice was originally a response to a data scarcity problem.
So I guess Common Voice is a bit of an umbrella term for platform, a data set. Could you talk a bit about those different aspects?
So there's many elements that make up Common Voice, and I really want to underscore here that Common Voice isn't just a technical piece. Common Voice is also a community piece. So Common Voice is a platform that allows data contributors, so people who speak a particular language or dialect, to contribute speech samples. And so originally Common Voice was designed to have, in the industry we call it elicited speech or read speech, and it's where I might go onto the platform and read out a sentence like, "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog." And that's one type of data that's used for speech recognition, but we've also expanded the platform recently into spontaneous speech. And so when we're talking with each other like we are now, if I try to transcribe the speech that we're using to speak in the podcast at the moment, we're not using read speech. So I'm not talking like this, like I'm reading from a book. We're having a really natural, free-flowing conversation. And so speech recognition engines tend to work better if they're trained on spontaneous conversational speech. So that's something that we've added into the platform recently. So it's a platform for data capture or people to contribute speech samples. Common Voice is also a set of data sets. So every language that is supported in the Common Voice platform gets a data set release about every 3 months. And so that data set contains the speech samples, it contains a transcription. And if people have volunteered to give us their demographic data, so their gender expression, their age, the accent that they speak with, that's something that also forms part of the data set. And that information is really important because what we found is that speech recognition tends to have a lot of biases. So it tends to work better for some people rather than others. And a lot of those biases come from the data that the speech technologies were originally trained on. So Common Voice is a platform. Common Voice is a data set. And Common Voice is also community. And so people don't just wake up one morning and think, gee, I'd like to go and donate some speech samples to Common Voice. I wish people thought that way, but unfortunately they don't. And so we do a lot of work with communities and language communities to encourage speech contributions and to help people build up language resources in their own community. And we've got some incredible examples of that. So, or one that's reasonably recent. There's a language group or a language community for the Pashto language, which is spoken in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Obviously an area that's seen a huge amount of conflict, has challenges with economic development. And when I say that Common Voice has 350 odd languages in its infrastructure, the importance of what the Pashto community has done will sort of shine through here. In less than 2 months, Pashto has taken the number 3 spot on the Common Voice leaderboard for the amount of data that's been collected. So the number 1 spot goes to the Catalan community from northern Spain. English is number 2. And as of this month, Pashto is number 3 in terms of the amount of data that's been collected. And the Pashto community has done that over just 2 to 3 months of work. And that's been through community coordination, grassroots campaigns, really getting into the community and letting the community know, hey, if you give us a sample of your voice, these are the speech technologies that are able to follow from that. So, yeah, Common Voice is a platform. Common Voice is data sets. Common Voice is community. And when we put a wrapper around all of that, Common Voice is shared public infrastructure. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here about theories of infrastructure because I don't want everyone to fall asleep and I start talking about different French philosophers. But when I talk about infrastructure, what I really mean is built technical environments that fade into the background that are taken for granted. And we don't know that they're there until they're missing or they're broken or they're not there. And so Common Voice is not just a platform, it's not just data sets, it's not just a community. Common Voice is a digital public good, it's digital public infrastructure.
One of the things that's really struck me is lurking on the Common Voice Discord is you just see these people joining and talking about their passion for their particular language or the data sets they're working with. And I find myself going down rabbit holes, languages I've never heard of. And it's just, it really sort of adds a more human element to it. And you just see such enthusiasm for the work that's being done. And it's kind of really refreshing. And I think, as someone who works and lives predominantly in English, just a really good reminder that, so much of the world doesn't converse in English.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Satiras. I think when we think about the stats, because of course I'm going to pull out some data here, there are 8 billion people in the world and there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world by 8 billion people. If I go back 2 or 3 years, there were 7,200 languages spoken. So there's a huge piece here about language loss and about cultural loss and identity loss. And I think a lot of the work that is done in Common Voice is driven by the desire to ensure that cultures survive, because culture is grounded in language. So in English, we don't have words for things that are in other cultures, and other cultures have a lot more nuance and a lot more description for things that we can't express particularly well in English. And this is where technologies like machine translation that translate from one language to another often fall down. And I think of different idioms from different languages, and sometimes I think English is actually an incredibly clumsy language that lacks a lot of expressiveness. And so I think being able to recognise that there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world by 8 billion people, and only 1.2 billion people speak English. So there are 6 billion people for whom, 6 billion people who don't speak English.
So focusing a bit more on yourself, Kathy, what was your contribution, or what is your ongoing contribution to Common Voice?
So I've bounced around a little bit with Common Voice. I think I've had 2 different stints with Common Voice, and now I'm in a third role with Mozilla Data Collective. So when I started my PhD at ANU in 2020, which seems like the before times now, my original PhD topic was focusing on voice bias and bias in speech data that's used to build speech technology. And through a series of incredibly serendipitous connections, one of my PhD advisors ended up being Dr. Joe Fish-Kay, who at the time was the Emerging Technologies lead for Common Voice. And so I was able to do some part-time work with the Common Voice project, which was, an incredible opportunity. And so my role there was as a voice data specialist, and I did a lot of work with metadata and how we were representing speech data. So some of my work there looked at, we have all of this language data and speech data in Common Voice, but whose voices are actually being represented? And when we started to do some of that analysis work, we realised that for many languages, not all, there are some exceptions. Off the top of my head, some of the Southern African languages, and I think Japanese are the exceptions. But for most languages on Common Voice, most of the data samples are from younger people and from people who identify as male. And so when we think about things like representing older women in speech technologies, that's something that, we have to consider, how do we have more representation from older women in speech technologies so that we don't inculcate or reproduce some of the societal biases that we already have.
What sorts of techniques have you used to try and overcome those sort of selection biases?
So a lot of this comes down to Common Voice, a tiny team, a handful of people working within Mozilla. This is where we really leverage that community aspect of the Common Voice community. So we often work with regional researchers who do a lot of work within their language communities and who have a real understanding of the different community groups and community organisations who have an interest in recording speech data. And one of the really interesting case studies there is from a region in Spain, in northern Spain called Catalonia, And it's a really interesting intersection of language, culture, identity, and independence. So, for a long time, just like in Australia, where Indigenous languages were marginalised and oppressed for a long time, and that's led to a break in generational transmission and colonial practices, which lead to linguistic and cultural erasure. In northern Spain, there was a similar process for many years where the Catalan language, which is close to Spanish but not the same, I was oppressed for many years. It wasn't allowed to be spoken. It wasn't an official language of government. And so, as part of the Catalan independence movement, we saw this incredible desire for people from Catalonia to record Catalan. And so, in the metadata that we have around the Catalan data set in Common Voice, we actually find that for Catalan, many of the speakers are much older, and we have a much better gender balance in the speakers because the younger generation never learned to speak Catalan because of this process of colonisation and language oppression. And that's been a huge eye-opener for me in terms of the links between language, culture and power.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Does this happen a lot? Do you sort of pick up these really interesting sort of human stories and factoids about, language across the world?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things we ask people when they join the Common Voice project or the Mozilla Data Collective, what languages do you speak? Because people often come to us with, a fascination for languages and a fascination for cultures. And, one of my colleagues, Professor Fran Tyers, who I think he's up to 20 languages that he can speak fluently, just incredible awe of Fran. So often people come to us with very strong languages background. But there's lots of stories like that in the Common Voice project. This is Common Voice as digital public infrastructure, as cultural infrastructure. Another really interesting story there is the story of Uyghur. So the Uyghur community is geographically in China. They are culturally and ethnically very different to many other Chinese groups. And the Uyghur language has gone through, again, very similar forces of constraint. And so the Uyghur language can be written in two different scripts. It can be written in Cyrillic script and it can be written in Perso-Arabic script. And different parts of the community have preferences for writing in different ways. And rather than having a particular linguistic ideology or a particular view of how Common Voice believes that Uyghur should be written, one of the things that we did to try and accommodate, what is very natural language variation across communities is change the Common Voice platform so that you can have speech data that is recorded in multiple writing systems, multiple orthographies. And so by making what is really a small technical change, we're better able to meet the needs of different sub-communities within a language community. And that's something we're really proud of as well. We didn't realise when we started the project just how intertwined language is with concepts of power, concepts of governance, concepts of diversity and equity across language communities. So it's been a real eye-opener for me in terms of, perhaps I was overly naive, but here I was thinking that, speech data is just, signal processing and it has, decibel readings and then we align it with a transcript and it's data, what is the politics and the culture and the power interplay here? And I think that's been a huge learning for me.
Speaking of messy data, what sort of opportunities do you see for applications of Common Voice in the GLAM sector?
The first thing that I want to say about messy data and Common Voice and the GLAM sector is really about diversity, equity, and really about representation. And if I think about the work that many GLAM institutions do and what their mission alignment is, so they're often government funded, they operate in the public interest, that public is diverse and that public is broad and that public in Australia speaks 250 languages, not just English. So I think that there's a lot of values alignment that I see between Common Voice and GLAM institutions. And I see a lot of the work that Common Voice does in creating digital public infrastructure and digital public goods also being part of the work that GLAM institutions do in creating digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. So if I step back to 2017 and I step back to what I see as the birth of the current era of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and I think about where the labeled data came from that goes into things like ChatGPT that labels images, and I think about the very well labeled text data for things like Wikipedia and Wikidata, a lot of the data that has gone into foundation models for artificial intelligence now actually came out of GLAM institutions. So GLAM institutions have done a lot of the hard work for AI and machine learning, and I'm not sure that they're getting a lot of the benefits that have come out of the AI and ML advancements that we're seeing.
I was wondering if there are any sort of existing case studies or partnerships for Mozilla Common Voice with GLAM or Research Institute.
With Common Voice, not specifically. So we have individual research agreements with individual language researchers. And one of my colleagues in this space is a person called Misam Alam. He does a lot of work with Pakistani languages. That's an incredibly interesting use case because if we think about how languages develop geographically, often what you find is that geographical boundaries like mountains lead to linguistic isolation because people can't get over the mountains to share languages, and we don't get like the languages mixing together. And there's like a whole series or a whole piece of research here around how the internet has allowed language spread and how language is flattening because everybody speaks the same sort of, everybody speaks the same form of English, or everybody speaks the same sort of language now because the internet's flattened everything. Misam's work is fascinating because in Pakistan, especially in northern Pakistan and around the Afghan borders, Pakistan is all mountains, mountain. And so you go over one mountain and you drop into a different language and you go over another mountain and you drop into, a related and possibly mutually intelligible variant of the same language, but it's different enough that speaker one may not be able to understand speaker two. Anyway, Misam's work is incredibly fascinating because he's documenting and recording a lot of these very, very, very diverse languages of Pakistan and Afghanistan, where we have only thousands of speakers of those languages, but often they don't speak any other language. And so there's sorts of questions around economic participation and societal participation and marginalisation in a technical society. So again, we get back to the concept of language is data, language is power, language is social inclusion, language is economic inclusion, and we get back to the, language is power.
In terms of Mozilla Common Voice, you've already touched on a couple of the challenges, particularly around, the biases towards English. I wonder if there's any other sort of broad topics around challenges that you've encountered.
So the way I like to frame this is not so much challenges, because I think framing it as challenges frames it as a problem when I don't want to frame it as a problem. I want to frame it as something that is a natural occurrence. I don't want to problematize something that I don't see as a problem. In language, we have an enormous amount of natural variation. So I'm a woman, and you can probably hear that I'm a woman because I speak with a higher register than you, Satirius. And so, if I were a man, I would probably speak down here and I'd speak, 20 hertz lower. So there are gender differences in how we speak. There are accent differences in how we speak as well. So you can see, or you can't see, you can hear that I speak with an Australian accent because I say things like vase to rhyme with Mars, whereas my American colleagues say days to rhyme with ways. And so we have all of this natural variation in language. So we have that acoustic variation, the accent variation, but we also have lexical variation in how we speak as well. So as an Australian, it would be completely normal for me to say to one of my friends, there's been a bingle of Broady. The Western's chockers back to the servo, and I'm going to be late for bevies at Tomo's. So that Australian slang and those Australian contractions are completely natural speaking in an Australian context, but my American or my British friends might say, Kathy, what on earth are you talking about? And so we have lexical variation in language as well. And so we also have variation over time. So if we listen to news broadcasts of the 1950s and 1960s, welcome to the ABC News. The accents differ, the wording that's used differs, even spelling changes over time. So it's like program, double M-E versus program with one M. So we have all of this linguistic variation, we have speech variation, and we also have what I call time variation in language. And one of the things that we've had to work through with Common Voice, because when Common Voice was originally established, it recorded read speech or elicited speech, so you read a sentence. And because of the way the Common Voice is licensed, because its digital public infrastructure is very openly licensed, all of those sentences are public domain as well. And one of the ways in which we get sentences that are licensed public domain is from projects that are out of copyright. So one of the biggest out of copyright projects is Project Gutenberg, which has text works that are out of copyright. Copyright only lasts 70 years in Australia. And so you get things like tenements and buggy carts in the read speech sentences. You don't get things like, I'm running this on a GPU with 28 gig of RAM, right? Because those things don't occur in Project Gutenberg because they weren't invented yet. And so we have a challenge of temporality with speech. So if I think about how Gen Alpha speaks, like skibbity Ohio Riz, we don't have anything that's out of copyright that's going to have the phrase skibbity Ohio Riz for somebody to read that in Common Voice, right? So one of the ways that we've tackled this, instead of having read speech, we're now moving to spontaneous speech. So instead of asking people to read a sentence, we'll ask them to answer a question. And that question might be, tell us about your shopping trip, or tell us about what you did with your friends on the weekend. And so we're eliciting a much more conversational, a much more naturalistic use of phrases and expressions. And I don't know, somebody might use the word skibbity Ohio Riz in their response. So that's a challenge. There's another, and sort of coming back to natural language variation, in many languages exhibit what's called code switching. So in code switching is where there are elements of two or more languages that are used at the same time. So for example, in Singapore, you will often hear English mixed with Malay or Tamil or various forms of Chinese because of the ethnic diversity in Singapore. And so we call that Singlish, but it's English which is code switched with many other languages. So, for example, in Nairobi in Kenya, you have a dialect called Sheng, which is Kiswahili code switching with English. And in parts of Africa that were colonized by the French, you will have, like in Rwanda, you will have Kinyarwanda, which code switches with French. So you have French words dropped into Kinyarwanda. And so one of the challenges that we have is for machine learning and artificial intelligence, how do you train a model that understands that this might contain like both Kiswahili and English, or it might contain English that is Malay accented that has Tamil words as well as Chinese. So that's also another example of very natural language variation. But how do we represent that variation in machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so you come along with a maybe a more rigid metadata structure and say, what language is this? And it's actually, well, it's not one language. It could be two or three in the same sentence. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm reminded when I was doing my PhD, I did a stint for another large company, and I'm not going to name them in the podcast, but they're very big. And I was working in their speech recognition team, and we were collecting data for a speech recognition project, and somebody was giving me the list of requirements because it was my job to go and find the data, and they were listing the languages that they needed speech data for, English, Japanese, Spanish. And I said, well, which Spanish do you want? And I got a bit of a blank look back. And I said, well, You know that Spanish is spoken in Spain, Castilian Spanish, but there's huge variation between Barcelona in the north and Valencia in the south. Like there's a huge variation of Castilian Spanish. And then when we go over to Latin America, we've got Spanish spoken in Mexico, we've got Spanish spoken in Guatemala, which often code switches with Guarani languages. And then if you go to Miami or Florida in the US, or you go to Texas or the southern US states, you often have English which is code switched with southern Latin American Spanish as well. So there's many different forms of Spanish. And I think that was a huge eye-opener for me in terms of the mental models that people have of languages as categories and the huge amount of human language variation that there is in the world. So yeah, that's my which Spanish question that I keep coming back to.
So that feels like a good opportunity to dig a bit more into your background and your work experience.
So there were two things I was very good at when I was in high school. I was very good at computers and I was very good at languages. And if I go back even further, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a little girl. So I was obsessed with space, and this was like the 1980s, and then Challenger happened, and I thought, maybe not a good longevity career option there. So I ended up being very good at computers and very good at languages in high school. And when I got to university, I didn't want to one or the other. And I ended up getting into a double degree program at Deakin in Geelong. And I was able to do both information systems and get an arts degree in languages. Wow. And as things transpired, I ended up not working in languages for a long time. I ended up working in IT for a university for many, many years. But then I left the university and I ended up working for a voice assistant company. And now you can start to see the languages and the technology coming together. And that was a privacy-focused voice assistant company that operated in different languages. And so I was drawing on my language skills again and my understanding of how linguistics and languages work. And then I was actually here in Melbourne in 2018 at a conference called DDD Melbourne, which is a developer conference. And Genevieve Bell had just come back from Silicon Valley, back from Intel. And two of my friends, Sarah Germain and Cameron Tudball, were with me at the conference. And they said, look, Genevieve Bell's starting this new master's program at ANU. You should totally apply. And I'm like, I'll never get in. Like, I'm not going to apply. And so Sarah and Cameron, being the incredible humans they are, they said, all right, we dare you to apply. And so, how do I say no to a dare? Your friends dare you. It's an Australian thing to do. And so I applied to the ANU. At the time, it was the 3A Institute's Masters in Applied Cybernetics program on a dare. Ended up getting through the first round. I flicked this. Ended up getting through the second round and thought, maybe I'm in with a chance. And I got out of the interview, the third round interview, and the penny dropped that wasn't a selection interview. It was a confirmation interview. And about 10 minutes later, I pick up the phone and it was Genevieve Bell on the other end. And she said, Kathy. And Genevieve, how are you? I said, I need you to move to Canberra. You're starting a new master's course next year. And so I packed up from Geelong and I headed to Canberra for what I thought would be a year. Did well in the master's program. It was an incredible opportunity. Got into the PhD program from that. And it ended up doing a PhD in voice data and speech data and voice data bias. So that's how two very disparate threads of language and technology have resulted in me working for Mozilla.
I don't think I've ever heard of anyone doing a PhD on it, basically on a dare, or the consequences of a dare. Mm-hmm. What struck me there was, and it's something I've experienced myself and talked to other people, is that sort of false dichotomy, I guess, between arts and science that's forced on you from a very young age. And it kind of reminded me of, when you're talking about, which Spanish, it's like, it's a really, it's a false way of codifying things. And actually, it's just great that you've been able to combine those two interests in your career.
I couldn't agree more. I think if we think about the problems that we're solving in the world today, if we think about problems that are wicked problems, they're intractable, they're problems of systems, they're problems of ecosystems, they're problems of collective action, they're problems of getting many people with many different opinions and many different viewpoints to work constructively together for a shared objective. There's a beautiful quote by Norbert Wiener. He's part of the foundation of the cybernetics discipline. And when he was talking about cybernetics in the 1960s, he was saying the poets shall have to become engineers, or the engineers shall have to become poets. And that's something that I reflect on quite a lot. I think we impose false dichotomies on many categories in the world because it helps us deal with them individually. Whereas if we were able to break down some of those boundaries and work across those categories, I think we would see a lot more situations where the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. It's not arts or science, it's arts and science.
Can you tell us a little bit about Mozilla Data Collective, who you work for currently?
So I'm currently the head of AI and machine learning at the Mozilla Data Collective. And the Mozilla Data Collective was really born out of some of the challenges that we saw around data being used for AI and machine learning in ways that weren't true to the values of what Mozilla stood for, and weren't true to the values of what we saw as collective action and digital public infrastructure. One of the challenges that we have with the data that's being used to build machine learning models is that it's being scraped from everywhere. So if we think about how ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini has been trained, the data for that training is enormous, absolutely enormous. And so we measure training data for machine learning and artificial intelligence in a unit called tokens. And tokens are basically just bits of chopped up words. And so when people train things like Claude or ChatGPT, we're now at a scale where it takes trillions of tokens. So that's, trillions of web pages, trillions of books, trillions of pieces of content. And all of that content comes from somewhere. And what we're finding at the moment is that that content is getting scraped without permission, without consent. And more importantly, without any of the benefit or any of the value that has gone into creating that data and going back to the organizations or the communities or the people who created that data. And with Mozilla Data Collective, we wanted to try and create a platform for ethical data sharing and a platform that created better value exchange. So some organizations may have a mission or may have an objective to freely share the data that they create. That might be part of the mission and the objective. That's absolutely fair and reasonable. But there are also organizations who create a lot of data in the process of their business activities, where that data really should be a revenue generation piece for the organisation. And in particular, we saw media organisations who have a lot of content online, but they weren't generating any revenue from having that content online, but that content was getting scraped to feed artificial intelligence. And they were also losing traffic that was sort of being captured by various different search engines as well. So we saw some market changes that led us to think, well, is there a way to have fairer value exchange in the data market, AI and machine learning? Data that is consented, data that is collected ethically, data that returns benefits to the people in the organizations who create that data. And so that's really the driver for the Mozilla Data Collective. It's an evolution of Common Voice. All of the Common Voice data is now held on the Mozilla Data Collective. But it's also an attempt to try and overcome some of the challenges that we saw in the data infrastructure, in the data infrastructure ecosystem.
One small thing you dropped in there was your resistance to using the more popular LLMs. I was just wondering, do you have alternatives, and how do you make those decisions, and how do you think about them?
The way that I'd like to answer this question is coming back to conscientious consumption. I think nowadays very few of us would go and buy a leather jacket or go and buy, say, a fur coat without understanding where the materials for that item came from, whether we were happy that the production of that material was sustainable and sourced ethically. It's like having fair trade cocoa in your chocolate. It's like having fair trade coffee beans. When I think about conscientious consumption in the AI space, I think there's still a gap in understanding around what does conscientious consumption mean when I'm typing a query into Claude or into ChatGPT or into Gemini, around how the model underneath has been built, how it's been powered. And I think there's all sorts of conscientious consumption pieces to unpack there. For example, where did the data come from that was used to build the model? Was that sourced ethically? Was it sourced sustainably? Who benefited from that data? And if we think about some of the news stories that have become headlines with at least one of the organisations in question, I won't name them specifically so that we stay very neatly away from any legal issues, but we've seen large big tech companies buy up books, scan them, ingest them into their models, because this is all legal, because our copyright hasn't really caught up for AI and machine learning, and then just dispose of those books. But the authors don't get any revenue, or the authors don't get any royalties when a query is answered that uses data that's taken from their book. We don't have a good understanding of what conscientious consumption means for AI and ML models. So that's the commercial models. And if we think about open source models, there are still challenges and concerns there as well. So one of the big data sets that's used to build open source large language models is Common Crawl. So Common Crawl is a huge data set that is a crawl, essentially a scraping of the entire World Wide Web. It's intended not to be, or it's not for profit, so Common Crawl doesn't generate a profit from crawling and creating the Common Crawl data set. But the sites that are scraped with Common Crawl still don't get any revenue or any benefit from having been in Common Crawl. So if then a model is trained on Common Crawl, like Mistral is trained on Common Crawl, and you use Mistral locally on your laptop, you install it and configure the GPU and drink lots of coffee while doing that. There's still a conscientious consumption gap there, because there's still no value exchange for the people whose data went into Common Crawl. So I can see both sides of the equation here. The people who see Common Crawl as digital public infrastructure, building an alternative to commercial models that people might be very heavily dependent on. But the people whose data is in Common Crawl, I think, also have a fair point around, well, we're not getting any value out of being in Common Crawl. And so as a response to that, we've seen the Common Crawl scraper be blocked from a lot of websites, which changes the composition of what's in Common Crawl. So we're starting to see people block their websites from crawlers, and we're starting to see the use of network technology. Like now when you go on many websites, you have to check a box to say I'm human. And that technology is actually trying to keep out the web scrapers so that the content on that website isn't scraped and doesn't end up in data sets for training AI and machine learning models. So I think there's a lot of nuance here. I think there's many different issues to consider in conscientious consumption for LLMs. And I think what I think we need to be doing, this is Kathy speaking, Mozilla obviously doesn't have an official position on this because it's an Australian space. I think we've seen a lot of backwards and forwards around regulation of AI and machine learning in Australia. So originally we were going to have some stronger legislation that legislated a lot of data provenance and a lot of sort of data set supply chain. That legislation has been softened. That's not going to go through anymore. We've got voluntary AI guardrails in Australia, but they're voluntary and they're guardrails. They're not legislation and they're not law, and no one can be sort of held to account because they're voluntary guardrails. And so I think we're missing an opportunity for legislation which would help bring to the fore some of the conscientious consumption pieces around AI and machine learning and where the data that feeds them comes from.
Yeah, I'm struck that maybe Mozilla Data Collective is, it's an attempt to sort of to clarify exactly where the data is coming from.
Absolutely. Let's say you and I, we had a coffee this morning when we caught up. If we wanted to, we could ask some really pointed questions about where did the coffee beans come from? Where did the soy milk come from? In Melbourne, where did the water come from? And we would have reasonably clear answers to each of those questions, like the soybeans were sourced here, the water came from, Melbourne water, the coffee beans came from, wherever they came from. And we would get reasonably clear answers to that supply chain. If I ask, where does the data come from, a popular LLM like ChatGPT or Claude or Mistral, it's much more opaque. And what transformation did the data go through? Who consented to giving that data? Where did the value of the data go through? So I think if we start to think about data as a supply chain, it helps us to think about how we might regulate the data set supply chain. And when I start to think about some of the standards that are coming onto the scene, so there was a new artificial intelligence standard, because I'm a nerd. I like reading artificial intelligence standards when I'm not, digging into metadata. I like that. I'm in a safe space. We're talking about artificial intelligence standards. So there's a new standard called AS 42001, and it's the International Artificial Intelligence Standard. I won't put everyone to sleep by talking about it in detail, but a large part of this standard is really about data provenance and data set supply chain. Where did the data that you're using in your artificial intelligence models come from? And I think that's going to be something we're going to have to think about at a much broader scale in terms of regulation and compliance and governance, particularly for large organisations who might be using multiple different LLMs or multiple different artificial intelligence tools in their suite of operations. How do you track that, you don't have a supply chain risk with using those models?
What's coming up next for Mozilla Data Collective? What does the future look like?
One of the big things that we really want to do is provide the ability for people to create a revenue stream from their data. And so within the next month or two, we will be rolling out payments. So people will be able to host a data set on the Mozilla Data Collective platform, and they'll be able to charge money for that data set. Obviously, the larger the data set, the more niche it is, the higher the quality, the more they'll be able to charge for that data set. But we want to be able to help people create a revenue stream from their data. And some of the biggest interest we've seen has been from cultural institutions. So cultural institutions, both in Australia but also in Europe and the United States, are facing two very different pressures. So they're facing the pressure to maintain their cultural mission, which might be to share knowledge openly or to preserve a cultural heritage record, depending on the type of institution, whether it's a gallery, a library, archive, or museum. But by and large, they're also facing incredible funding pressures. So, with the general economic climate, we're seeing the retraction of funding from cultural institutions and the retraction of the ability to deliver on that mission. And so we've got a lot of interest from cultural institutions who are looking to generate revenue from the cultural data that they hold in order to preserve and protect and uphold the mission, their public institution mission. And moreover, what we're hearing from a lot of cultural institutions, particularly those that have large repositories of data, is that they're facing a massive infrastructure risk. So one of the challenges that is presented by large data scraping and unauthorized data scraping on the web, if you have a web server, if you have like a data repository on the web, what's happening at the moment is that there are so many scrapers and bots who want to suck all that data out for machine learning. People are spending all their time trying to stop the bots and scrapers. And so there's this added workload of having to try and stop the bots and scrapers from getting to the data that it's your mission to create and to protect. It's like not only are they scraping the data, they're creating more work for people in trying to stop the scrapers. So it's this it's the double whammy that cultural institutions are facing.
This may be me projecting, but one thing that struck me with having followed Common Voice and Data Collective over the past year or so is that it's a nice contrast with a lot of modern technology where the releases seem a lot more considered and it sounds like a value judgment, but at a slower pace. And I just wonder, is that part of how you develop things?
It's a great observation. What we try to do with both Common Voice and the Mozilla Data Collective is be very considered and to be very values aligned. So, for example, with Common Voice, we do a data set release every 3 months. That's a trade-off between the infrastructure time it takes to do a release of data for 350 languages. It's still we've automated a lot of it, but there's still a lot of work involved in doing that. But it's also about making sure that there's a significant improvement in every 3 months, and not every language will have a lot more data every 3 months. But for many languages, they've got set up on the platform, they've got sentences, they've got data in the platform, and so they're really eager to get, particularly for new languages, they're really eager to get their first release. So we wanted a cadence that supported that. And I've had the honour of working with a partner in the APNIC Foundation. So APNIC does a lot of the low-level networking infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region. And part of their foundation work is getting better participation across technology in Asia-Pacific languages. And so we've worked with APNIC Foundation to bring Sundanese and Javanese, which are both languages spoken in the island of Java in Indonesia. So we're bringing those languages onto the platform for the first time, and they're going to get released in this release. So it's incredibly exciting there. There's also some other, what I'd call values considered pieces in the Mozilla Data Collective and how we think about data. And one of the other pieces that we do here is something that we call slow consent. So in an era where you have to check terms and services and you have to check boxes to get anywhere on the internet, we've created, when I say we, our techno-social systems have created a default where we just tick and we don't think about the consequences of terms and conditions. And so we wanted to be really deliberate about what we call slow consent. We want people to consider, when you're signing up to download a data set, here are the terms and conditions and the constrictions and the restrictions on using that data. And we want people to be really comfortable that those are the restrictions that you're agreeing to when you choose to download a data set. So that's what we think about when we think about slow consent, and making sure that people are thinking deeply about the data that they're downloading. They're not just set and forget and ending up with a hard drive to then train a model on.
I wondered if you could talk a bit about Mozilla's presence in Australia and how that impacts your work life and what your typical workday looks like.
Sure. So I can't speak for other areas of Mozilla. I can only speak for the area of Mozilla that I work in. And I've met a lot of my Mozilla Australian colleagues, and there's quite a few in Melbourne, and we catch up for coffee, and they're fantastic. Hi Paul, hi Reem. So one of the things that I do, which is perhaps a little bit unusual for the people who work in Australia, I work an altered work pattern. So I start my workday about 6 o'clock at night, and I go through to about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, which works perfectly for me because I'm a night owl and I don't do mornings. I know that it wouldn't suit everybody, but it's sort of the best of both worlds. So I get to do the stuff I need to do during the day and some of my family commitments. But then I'm able to work for a multinational organisation remotely. So I'm based in Geelong. And I think when I think about the world of work in AI and the world of work in the knowledge economy of, the 2030s, we're going to be in the 2030s in about 3 years' time. We need to be thinking much more broadly and much more flexibly about how we bring great people together to do great things, facilitated by the internet. I remember being at high school in the early 1990s and thinking, gee, one day I'm going to log in from a terminal and I'll be working with people in the States, and I won't have to get on a plane, and I won't have to travel for 26 hours to get somewhere, and I'll be able to work with some of the, the brightest minds in the country. And that's what I've been able to do working remotely with Mozilla.